She didn't make a promise to never look back. She didn't declare it. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't convince herself with words. She simply realized that going back was no longer possible, not because the past was bad, not because it had no comfort, but because it no longer fit who she had become. For a long time, looking back felt tempting. Old habits felt familiar. Old ways of thinking felt safe. Old versions of herself felt easier to manage. Even after God had healed her, there were moments when the past still whispered. Not loudly, quietly. You knew how to survive there. You knew what to expect. You didn't have to trust so deeply. Moving forward required faith. Going back required only memory. And memory can feel safer than trust. She noticed that God was not pulling her forward forcefully. He was inviting her to walk, one step at a time, without constantly checking behind her, without measuring herself against who she used to be. Walking forward did not mean forgetting the past. It meant no longer living from it. She understood something subtle but decisive. God had not freed her, so she could keep revisiting what once held her. He had healed her, so she could live from a new place. Looking back was no longer sinful. It was simply unnecessary, because what God was doing now required her attention. The future God was forming could not be entered while she kept turning around to measure how far she had come. Walking forward meant trusting that God's work in her was real enough to stand without comparison, and that was harder than she expected, because not looking back means letting go of old reference points, old identities, old explanations, old reasons for why she was the way she was. It meant allowing God to define her present without negotiating with her past. And yet, this was the freedom she had been given, not the freedom to erase the past, but the freedom to stop being pulled by it. If you are in a season where you sense God asking you to walk forward without constantly revisiting who you used to be, without romanticizing old versions of yourself, stay. This message is for the woman who is learning that healing does not mean you never remember the past. It means the past no longer decides where you walk. And if these words feel close to where you are right now, consider subscribing. Not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return when God invites you to walk forward without looking back. Now, let's talk about what makes that possible and why God doesn't ask us to keep turning around. Looking back felt familiar, familiar patterns, familiar explanations, familiar ways of understanding herself. The past gave her language. It explained her fears, justified her reactions, made her pain make sense. And because it made sense, it felt safe. Walking forward was different. Walking forward asked her to trust what she could not yet name, to live without rehearsing old wounds, to respond without relying on former defenses. The past had given her tools that once protected her, but protection can quietly become limitation. She realized that every time she looked back, she was measuring herself by who she used to be. How far have I come? Am I better than before? Would I have reacted differently back then? Those questions kept her anchored to a version of herself God was no longer forming. Looking back wasn't rebellion. It was hesitation. A hesitation rooted in fear, a fear of trusting the change fully, fear of discovering that walking forward would require a deeper surrender, because if she stopped looking back, she would have to trust that God's work in her was sufficient. She would have to believe that healing was real, even without constant comparison, and that felt vulnerable. The past offered proof. The present required faith. The past could be reviewed. The present had to be lived. She noticed how often she returned to old reference points when she felt uncertain, not because she wanted to go back, but because she wanted reassurance. Reassurance that she wasn't losing herself, that she wasn't becoming careless, that she wasn't forgetting lessons learned. But God was not asking her to forget. He was asking her to stop living from what had already passed. She began to see that walking forward was not an act of bravery. It was an act of trust. Trust that God's healing did not need constant supervision. Trust that growth did not need to be measured daily. Trust that she could live present without auditing her past. Looking back had once helped her survive, but now it was quietly slowing her down, and God was inviting her to move freely, not by denying where she had been, but by trusting where He was leading. She didn't realize how often she was measuring herself not against others, but against her past. Every step forward was quietly compared to who she used to be. How would I have handled this before? Would this have broken me back then? Am I really different or just calmer? These questions felt reasonable, responsible, even wise, but they kept her divided. Part of her was living forward. Another part kept checking behind her. God began to reveal something gently. Measuring herself was keeping her focused on improvement, not on presence. She was tracking progress. Instead of inhabiting the change, she was auditing her healing instead of trusting it. God was not asking her to prove growth. He was inviting her to live from it, because growth that needs constant verification never fully rests. It stays alert, watchful, prepared to retreat if something feels off. She noticed how measuring herself kept old identities alive, identities shaped by fear, by survival, by explanation. As long as she kept measuring, those identities stayed relevant. But God had already moved her. She was no longer who she used to be, even if she couldn't always define who she was becoming. And that uncertainty was uncomfortable, because letting go of measurement meant letting go of control. It meant trusting that God's work did not need to be monitored, that healing does not reverse, because it is not constantly inspected. God was asking her to live present, without self-surveillance, to respond without checking old patterns, to trust her instincts without fear of regression. And this was difficult, because measuring herself had once protected her. It had helped her stay aware, prevent mistakes, avoid falling back. But God was not asking her to become careless. He was asking her to become confident, confident that the change He had formed was strong enough to hold her steady. She began to release the habit of comparison, not suddenly, not completely, but intentionally. And as she did, something surprising happened. She felt lighter, less tense, less guarded, less concerned with proving. She had changed. She was no longer performing growth. She was living it, and that allowed her to walk forward without constantly turning around. As she stopped looking back, she had to learn something new, how to trust where she was standing. The past had familiar ground. She knew its terrain, its dangers, its patterns. Even pain felt predictable there, but the ground God had given her now felt unfamiliar, not unstable, just new. She could no longer rely on old instincts, old explanations, old habits of self-protection. Walking forward meant trusting a ground she hadn't tested yet, and that required humility. She had to accept that she didn't know herself fully anymore, that the version of her shaped by survival was no longer in charge. This felt disorienting, because when identity shifts, certainty wavers. She wasn't who she was, but she wasn't fully comfortable with who she was becoming either. And God met her there, not by rushing clarity, not by forcing confidence, but by giving her stability. Step by step, she noticed that situations that once demanded defense now invited discernment. Moments that once triggered fear now required trust. God was teaching her to respond from formation, not memory, to act from who she had become, not from who she had been. And this took patience, because trusting new ground means accepting that mistakes may happen, that not every step will feel secure. That learning is still part of walking. But God was not alarmed by that. He wasn't asking her to be flawless. He was asking her to be faithful. Faithful to stay present. Faithful to listen. Faithful to walk, without constantly checking behind her. She realized that walking forward did not mean she would never stumble. It meant she would no longer retreat. She would not run back to old ways of coping, just because the new way felt unfamiliar. God was teaching her to trust the ground He Himself had prepared, and slowly, that trust grew. Not as confidence in herself, but as confidence in God's work. The ground beneath her was firm, because God had placed her there. And that realization allowed her to move forward, without fear. At some point, she realized that moving forward was no longer about effort, it was about agreement. Agreement with what God had done. Agreement with who she was becoming. Agreement with the direction He was gently setting before her. She stopped dragging her past into every new moment. Not because the past had no meaning, but because it no longer had authority. She understood that constantly looking back was a way of delaying trust. Trust in God's healing, trust in God's work, trust in God's leading. Walking forward meant saying quietly, "I believe you have done enough in me to carry me into what's next." This was not arrogance, it was faith. Faith that God's transformation was real. Faith that she didn't need to keep checking herself for signs of failure. Faith that the ground ahead was prepared by God Himself. She no longer lived with one foot in the past and one foot in the present. She stood fully where God had placed her, and that posture changed how she lived. Decisions felt clearer. Reactions felt calmer. Faith felt simpler. Not easier, but simpler. She wasn't trying to prove she had changed. She wasn't trying to protect herself from going back. She was simply walking in the direction God was leading, and that was enough. Walking forward without looking back did not erase memory. It removed hesitation. It allowed her to live present. Instead of divided, God was not asking her to forget where she came from. He was asking her to trust where He was taking her. And when she finally agreed with that, movement came naturally. In the end, she didn't walk forward because the past stopped calling. She walked forward because God's voice became clearer. She learned that healing is not proven by how often we look back, but by how freely we move ahead. That growth does not require constant comparison. That faith does not demand endless self-examination. And that God does not heal us so we can remain cautious forever. He heals us so we can live. If you are in a season where God is asking you to stop revisiting who you were, to stop measuring every step, to trust the ground beneath you, let this be your reminder. You don't need to keep looking back to honor what God has already healed. You honor it by walking forward. If you want a place to return, when moving ahead feels unfamiliar or trust feels vulnerable, consider subscribing. Not for the channel, but for your journey. Because the God who brought you this far will not abandon you as you keep walking.